Hello working group members. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join the last meeting, but I did get to catch up viewing the recording, and I'd like to thank Adam for the progress update he gave on the Hep B hub and primary care outreach. I thought he really distilled the what and the why of those activities and set that in the context of the bigger picture, which I really appreciated. Some of the data that I'm going to run through in this recording, we are going to have a look at the Metro GP notifiers at the front. Adam's already been able to use that information to help find some target areas. And we'll also be having a look at the characteristics of cases of Hep B that have been notified over a decade. And I'm going to look closer at a couple of priority communities. I hope there will be some insights in here that are useful to other working group members. It's going to run a bit longer than the brief overview that I was slated for. The upshot in this intervening time, I've been able to dig a little bit deeper looking at these priority populations and prepare something a bit more visually interesting, more of a show and tell for you. I'm going to move quickly through some of the slides, but beauty of being a recording, you can pause if you need to have a look at the graphics more closely. And about halfway, there's a jumping off point. I'll recap sort of the notifiers and cases then, and you can tap out there if you wish to. And in case I forget to say so at the end, if any of the working group members have any specific queries, if there's anything you'd like to look for answers in the notifications data, please be in touch, and you have my email right there. So the objective was to see what could be learned from the data in WANTED, the Notifiable Diseases Database, about the notifiers and cases of Hep B notifications, specifically looking at Metro Perth and cold cases. I chose a 10-year period. This sort of started off as a fairly informal exercise, and that was a manageable amount. And there was quite a lot of manual data cleaning required, which sort of limited that extract. And because I did that extract in December, I opted for financial years. So we're looking at the decade up to the 30th of June 2024. And that was 5,342 cases for that period. That's all of the cases. And that's out of about 18,500 Hep B notifications in the database, which goes back to 1992. For those of you who don't work every day with WANTED and notifiable diseases, Hep B cases, unlike many of the other diseases, they're notified only once. There's a matching process that occurs when new data is added, and so repeat notifications are excluded. So with Hep B, the notifications can be fairly considered to represent unique patients. And why do we focus on Metro and cold? Well, the goal was initially to inform the nurse practitioner intervention pilot, which is to be Metro focused. And we know that roughly 80% of Hep B cases are metropolitan, it's Australia-wide. And we also know that nearly 70% of people living with chronic Hep B in Australia are born overseas. And over 90% of new cases of Hep B in Australia are attributable to migration. So that's the lens. So we'll look at notifiers by the service type and categories. I'll give you a metro and regional split. We'll look very briefly at notifiers of newly acquired cases, and we'll look at the geographical distribution of the Metro GP notifiers. So here we have a split by categories of notifiers. This is not in the WANTED data. I've had to go through and apply these categories to each of the notifying clinicians. And I've sort of got groupings here we've got the majority coming from the primary care settings, followed then by the HSPs. The other services here includes immigration, health screening, immigration detention, organ and tissue donation services. You'll see more of this on the next slide. And then the private sectors, your private specialist rooms and private hospitals. So breaking that down further, in this primary care slice, we see it's predominantly general practices, 60% of the overall notifications, ARCHO services with 3%, and and NGO community health services, 2% of notifications. HSPs, as you would expect, mainly from the sort of hospitals and health campuses, 14% of overall, and then there's 3% from what I'm calling other HSP, which is a grouping I've sort of made to distinguish some of the specialty HSP services. In this slice, the Anita Clayton Centre, the Humanitarian Entrant Health Service being a large piece of that. Private specialists, 6%, and private hospitals, just 1%. Caveat on that group is was very hard to distinguish the source of notifications from private sectors, so probably better to think of it as a 1-7% slice. And then other here is significant. We've got immigration health screening giving 6% of notifications, immigration detention 2%, same with blood, organ and tissue services, and there's 1% coming from prisons. So looking at the newly acquired cases of Hep B, that's 4% of overall notifications, and coming from primary care and HSPs, very little from the other categories. For those that don't work in notifiable diseases, newly acquired and unspecified, these are surveillance case definitions. They're not particularly clinically useful. They don't match too closely with clinical definitions for acute and chronic Hep B, and so it can be quite confusing. It's not particularly important for today, so I'm not going to get really into it, but just for a brief, just to cover it off, there's the newly acquired case definition is definitive lab evidence where a patient is known to be negative in the past 24 months, 2 years of known need, or there's evidence of a prior infection, and the unspecified category is definitive lab evidence of Hep B and no criteria for newly acquired. So the majority of cases we don't know, and they end up in the unspecified category. And that significance is really for the public health follow-up more than it is for the sort of ongoing clinical management. For newly acquired Hep B cases, these were the top 10 notifying services or practices. The tertiary metro public hospitals, as you might imagine, and there are a couple of GP practices ranking in there. And just to look at primary care notifiers of newly acquired, these are the practices in Perth with 2 or more notifications in that 10-year period of newly acquired Hep B. So that's 15 practices. Looking at the metro and regional split, 4,459 cases from metro and 853 from all other WA. And we're not going to look into regional cases in this presentation, but just to quickly have a look at the top 10 postcodes from regional notifications. And these place names here, these are indicative. The postcode is what's significant. Obviously, these postcodes can cover much larger areas than the named town or place, but just to give you a sense of, be able to place where that postcode is, these are the areas for those notifications. So now to look at the Metro GP notifiers. This is a list of the top 10 practices and the number of notifications that they sent in the 10-year period. There were 2,716 notifications from Metro GPs. That was 517 unique GP practices. So a huge spread, but in that the top 10 practices accounted for 21% of notifications, and the top 25 practices accounted for 35% of the notifications. So we do get this concentrated on particular practices. This is the GP notifiers mapped with Excel. Either it's a program limitation or me learning, it's hard to put a geographical markings onto the map. So in some of the later images it's harder to see the coastline, but I would suggest using this green island here as the landmark for yourself if you can't see the river. Then and that's it generally on all the maps, and there's a good landmark. But we can see here that the top notifying postcodes for GP notifiers are in that corridor of southern suburbs. 46% of the GP, I already said 46% of the GP notifications came from GPs practices in the top 10 notifying postcodes. And you see there's a down the southern corridor with Perth highlighted there, and then patch concentration in the northeastern suburbs there. Just to quickly look at the non-GP primary care services who've notified in this 10 years. This is those non-GP practices ranked. If I were to rank the whole category of primary care, if these were ranked with the GP notifiers, the SHQ inclusive of SHQ Magenta would rank at number 10, and M Clinic would come in at number 27. And I'm going to move on quickly, but I just wanted to point out, this is an ugly slide, but I thought it was interesting to note that even in these high notifying postcodes and high notifying suburbs, there are standout practices within each of those. It's sort of not spread across the area as, are doing a lot of hepatitis business. It's typically a big hitter or a couple of big hitters in those spaces. So I just thought this was interesting to note the unequal distribution. I imagine the factors would be size of practice, appointment availability, bulk billing, how long the practice has been open, if it wasn't the whole 10 years, and then those factors about health professional, kind of cultural, linguistic considerations that we will come to a bit later. This, I think, does have some utility in planning interventions and sort of zeroing in on higher volume centres. And that is if these are practices where patients still attend for ongoing care, which is a big if and something we don't know whether notifying practices are also practices where people continue to have their regular GP care. So now we will come to look at the notified cases. I'm going to break this down by looking at country of birth of person, and we'll look at some age and gender distribution and preferred languages. These are the notifications over the 10 years by country of birth of person. All overseas notifications made up 67%. Country of birth unknown, 20%. I'm going to talk about later about this unknown group and what we can do to make that smaller and more known. And the Australian born, we've got 13% of notifications. We'll go and split that further to look at countries of birth that are non-main English-speaking countries and mainly English-speaking countries, and this is going to require some explanation. It's a ABS statistical category. It's used in sort of migrant data analysis. It's a crude metric to help differentiate what we would consider culturally and linguistically diverse migrants from the large numbers of overseas-born Australians who are most likely to speak English. So the ABS has used this main English-speaking countries and non-main English-speaking countries delineation for quite a long time now. It took over really from a previous categorization of non-English speaking background, which you'll still see occasionally in ESB. So their definition of NMESC is it's a list of the main countries from which Australia receives or has received, the definition of main English speaking countries is it's a list of the main countries from which Australia receives or has received significant numbers of overseas settlers who are likely to speak English. And it's important to note that being from a non-main English-speaking country does not imply a lack of proficiency in English. So just for your own minds as we're going through the rest of this information, the main English-speaking countries, which are removed from most of what we're looking at, are Canada, England, Ireland, Northern Ireland, New Zealand, Scotland, South Africa, UK, USA, Wales. So when we split that further and and I show here the top 10 countries of birth overseas that are non-main English speaking countries, we can see the relative proportions. The top 5 non-main English speaking countries of birth account for nearly 1/3 of all the notifications, and close to half of the overseas born notifications. And the top 10 non-main English speaking countries of birth account for 41% of all notifications and 61% of the overseas born notifications. New Zealand is the only mainly English speaking country that would appear if we looked at top 10 all overseas notifications. It would rank 4th with 6.9% of all country of birth overseas notifications. So in some of the slides you'll see I've left New Zealand in for, and when we're only looking at non-main English speaking, New Zealand is removed. That's the only one that would change the rankings. I had a look at change in country of birth over time. I was interested to see what might have been changing over this decade. So I've taken here 3 time points. These are calendar years, and I have looked at the percentage change between 2015 and 2023 in the proportion of notifications. For Western Australia, China had a decline of 29% proportionally. Philippines up 64% and it moved from rank 4 to rank 2. Vietnam had a decline of 18% proportionally, dropped from rank 2 to rank 3. Burma, Myanmar proportion relatively unchanged, but up-ranked to 4th. India had a proportional increase of 80% and went from 9th to 5th. New Zealand down 26%. Malaysia unchanged, and Thailand up 44%. Not pictured here, but the largest change of any country of birth overseas was Pakistan with a 163% increase between 2015 and 2023, and that moved it from 20th to 9th ranked. And also not pictured PNG entering the top 10 in 2023. It had an increase. I've got 163% also here, but I think that might be an error. And dropping out of the top 10 over this 10 years, Sudan and Indonesia down 52% and 18% respectively. This is all quite consistent with, fairly consistent with the modelled trends that have been published for Australia-wide, which we'll have a quick look at on the next slide. So McLaughlin and Cowie looked at changes in the distribution of overseas born populations for chronic Hep B between the Australian censuses in 2011 and 2016. These are sort of modelled estimates. In this paper, they estimated the number of people living with chronic Hep B in Australia increased by 20% compared to a population increase of 8%. This reflected the relative increase in overseas born residents. China remained the most common country of birth, but it was growing over that 2011-2016 window proportionally in the cases, and they found the largest proportional increase for Pakistan, which we also saw in WA data, and they also saw large proportional increases from Taiwan, Nigeria, Afghanistan, India, which we saw, Myanmar, Burma, which we didn't see, and Thailand, which we did. So loose comparison to WA, noting that these, we have an observed trend in notified cases versus modelled estimates for a different time period. For China-born and Vietnam-born in WA, we see proportional decreases, which is different to the national model data. Philippines, we see proportional increase, but a larger one than the national data. New Zealand, fairly steady in these estimates, but in WA, proportionally was decreasing. Myanmar, Burma had a large proportional increase in the modelling. In WA, it remained steady. And The Pakistan cohort, consistent with that paper, was the largest proportional increase, and Thailand, the increase was very similar, up 44% in WA, which is very consistent. So here's the countries of birth of our cases mapped. Just to note here, again, Excel limitations, the colour gradient scale is not ideal. So these light coloured countries have only 1 or 2 notifications, and I will zoom in on our region. We see, as expected, predominantly cases coming from Northeast and Southeast Asia to Australia, and Sub-Saharan Africa to a lesser extent. So looking now at the overseas born, non-main English speaking countries and postcode distribution. So these are the postcode of cases who are in the NMESC category in Perth metro area. The top postcodes being 6061, which is around the Balgamira-Booker area, 6107 in the Cannington, East Cannington, Kenwick, Queen's Park area, 6155 around Canning Vale, Willetton, and 6064 Girraween, Kundula, Marangaroo in the north again. And just interestingly, one little case with the 6161 postcode of Rottnest. This is mapping the cases, postcodes of the cases with unknown country of birth. So that's 20% of all the notified cases have the country of birth field as unknown, not stated, or blank. And looking at these cases by their postcode distribution, similar hotspots here, but not exactly the same overlay as the non-main English speaking countries map. It does have the same top 3 postcodes in a different order, so 6155, 6107, 6061, but then the postcode 6000 appears, which is Perth, obviously, with 46 cases. There's no number on Perth in this image, but you can see that green spot down in the middle. I wonder whether this is true or whether there's some defaulting to the 6000 postcode instead of putting postcode unknown on notifications, because we don't see Perth coming up as quite, it's a frequent postcode for notifiers, but not a higher ranking postcode for cases. So not that many people relatively live in 6000. And 6164 also comes up here, which is further south towards the coast around that Coburn, South Lake Success area. So I don't know whether this, we would expect this group is largely, as all cases, overseas born and non-main English speaking, but whether the distribution of the countries of birth that make up this unknown country group is perhaps not even or not equal with cases overall. So we'll now look at age and sex distribution of the notified cases. This is the distribution for all cases, all notified cases of Hep B in WA over the 10 years to the 30th of June, and this is arranged by the year of birth, which is my first caveat. I were to do this again, I would push a 5-year age groups next time, which would be more typical, bit of learning while doing exercise, and to do with the way that I extracted the data from Wanted. And the other caveat here is I need you to use your imagination to remove the negatives on the male side of the axis. Obviously we don't have negative persons, but there are far too many steps involved in Excel to take that little mark off, so you just have to imagine it's not there. We can see that the overall case data, it skews slightly male, so it's 53% male, 47% female, and more than 50% of the cases born between 1970 and 1989. When we look at the country of birth non-main English speaking cohort, which as a reminder is 61% of the notifications overall, we see a slightly different shape. We have more even gender balance than the overall cohort. This group is 49% male, 51% female. It is slightly younger, with 58% of the cases born between 1975 and 1994. Looking side by side so you can see the shapes together, and we will have a look at the distributions for the top 2 countries of birth overseas, China and Vietnam cohorts, a little bit later on. And I've just thrown in a table here. It's going to be a little bit obscured by my head, just to show the other countries if you want to have a look here at the breakdown of the other top non-main English countries. There is some differences here. Most significantly, Thailand had the sharpest gender disparity, with 80% of notified cases being female, and noting that Thailand is also a proportionally rising cohort. The non-main English speaking countries, so the top non-main English speaking countries tend to have a skew female in the distribution, and we'll see that a little bit better. Now I'm going to look at preferred language, which is another of the called identifiers, the only other called identifier that is available in the notifications database data. We have with the preferred language indicator an even higher rate of incompleteness or of unknowns than we see in the country of birth field, and this really undermines the usefulness of this indicator. We have 67% of the notifications for the 10-year period with their preferred language field as unknown, not stated, or blank. And even where the country of birth of the case is overseas, so that's been completed and is known, even then in 62.5% of cases the preferred language field is still unknown, not stated, or blank. This did get slightly better over time, from 83% unknowns in 2015 to 63% in the 2023 notifications. So there is some improvement there, which is reassuring, but this is where we have a significant opportunity for improvement around the data quality. So what can we know from about language spoken at home in WA, since our data can't tell us much with reliability? OMI has published West Australian summary from the 2021 census data. It shows that 19% of West Australians speak a language other than English at home, and that the proportion of LOTE at home increased by 14% between the 2016 and 2021 censuses. So in the notifications data for Hep B, we would expect a much higher than the WA average LOTE at home, and yet only 15% of our notifications over the 10 years designated a preferred language other than English. And we'll get into the completeness later on. So here's the breakdown for what we have of preferred language. You can see the 68% unknown, and then showing the top 10 languages other than English that we do have information for here. And you can see their proportions. That pretty much tracks the what we would expect to see, both from the languages spoken in Western Australia and also the countries of birth of cases. So we've got China, Vietnam there, Philippines, the languages spoken in Burma, we can see Malaysia and Thailand as well. Full list of the top 20 preferred languages where that is known in the Hep B cases. So this is the top 20 with English and unknown removed. And just a comment on limited English proficiency, which is another called indicator that we don't collect data on in Western Australia, anywhere in the WA health system that I'm aware of, but it is a recommended called data metric. So we can't measure proficiency in our notifications data, but we can infer or learn some things from population data, from which we know, again from OMI's summary of the 2021 census, that 29% of people speaking Vietnamese at home in WA self-report low or no spoken English proficiency. 21% of the people speaking Mandarin at home in WA also report low or no spoken English proficiency. And the Burmese language groups have the highest proportion of low English proficiency of any of the language groups. And these are the same information for national figures of low English proficiency by language group. I won't dwell on this one. Okay, take two. We're going to have to split this into two recordings for technical reasons. So I'll just recap part one, the overview of 10 years of Hep B notifications. What did we learn from the notifications data? I think the major takeaway here is that if interventions were to focus on just 4 postcodes, so 2 in the north and 2 in the south, that would cover 20% of the metro cases notified in the last 10 years. It would also cover 22% of the metro GP notifiers of that period. And similarly, to focus strategies just on the top two overseas countries of birth, so the Chinese and Vietnamese group, that would cover nearly a third of the metro non-main English speaking notifications. We learned that preferred language is a key code identifier, and it's the only other identifier in the notifications data other than country of birth of person, and the incompleteness of this data is limiting any insights we can glean around language groups. And then moving into the next part, I'm going to look closer at geography and demography for China and Vietnam born cohorts. I'm going to look at some interstate qualitative research on people living with chronic Hep B born in China and Vietnam. I'm going to discuss the weaknesses and opportunities we've got around the cold data collection and have a brief look at the differences in primary care in Perth when we compare to other jurisdictions, and sort of considering the question of whether there may also be health system differences together with our patient cohort differences that's having a bearing on the cascades of care outcomes here.